Number 10. The end of an era. 1914. A super important dude in Sarajevo got capped in the back of his convertible. Some people are super cool about this, and others are not so super cool about this. So uncool, in fact, that they want to try out all the new fancy weapons and gadgets from the state-of-the-art technology that they've been stockpiling for years. The Ottomans, seeing that their empire was in a decline, saw an opportunity to solidify their place in Europe, strengthen their empire, and maybe just take some stuff from weaker countries. I hear Arabia has lovely sand and oil this time of year. So, how do we achieve victory, some Ottomans thought to themselves. It makes most sense to really join the stronger side, so that way we can almost guarantee our victory and be sitting at the right end of the negotiation table. Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire would form the Central Powers during the First World War. It went very well for the Central Powers for about 5 minutes, before the whole thing went cow udders up. Germany was bogged down in the east and the west, Austria was having a difficult time with the Russians, the Ottoman Empire learned that building railways through someone else's country to take their stuff isn't very cool. When the smoke settled, the once mighty and powerful Ottoman Empire dissolved. Hundreds of years of great wealth and conquest gone within a few short years after World War I had ended. It's almost as if they shouldn't have gotten involved in the first place. Number 9. Execute Order 66. When you get big like the Ottoman Empire, you need protection. You need something that's really gonna protect you. The United States has the Navy SEALs, the British has the Special Air Service, and I have a collection of 80s movies that's so nerdy it protects me and chases off any cute girl who comes near me. But the Ottomans were thinking ahead by introducing the Janissary Corps, a unit of elite troopers who were the first modern standing army in Europe, paid regular salaries, disciplined, and was one of the first militaries to have extensive use of firearms. Completely loyal to the Sultan, the Janissaries were a formidable fighting force. What happened to the Janissaries, I hear my bumblebees asking? Well, it's not so nice. A messy political climate was going to disband the Corps. Not liking the replacements coming in after the Janissaries, they revolted, which led to something known as the Auspicious Incident, where the barracks burnt down and 4,000 Janissaries lost their lives. Any remaining Jedi were hunted down and destroyed. Sorry, I meant Janissaries. Watched too much Star Wars in preparation for Boba Fett. All jokes aside, that was pretty cruel. You shouldn't burn people down like that, man. Not so cool. But the comparison between the two, it's there. Star Wars is cool. Number 8. Where art thou, brother? Kings will be kings, and the male patriarchy will be the male patriarchy. You want your dynasty to continue? Then you need a male heir. Like most European kingdoms, this is just how it goes. The Ottomans were no different, except maybe their version of the royal family game. See, the Ottomans like to compete for the throne, meaning if you got brothers, you're gonna have to fight them for it. But not like the fight over the Xbox controller, no, these brothers would be fighting for life or death, oftentimes and having a lot of bloodshed in order to determine the next ruler. In one extreme case, one sultan had his infant brother strangled to make sure his spot on the throne was secured, which is totally a normal human, kind-loving thing to do. I'm happy to say we no longer do this. Number 7. Well, that escalated quickly. Up until 1967, the war was bad. But it was nothing compared to what was going to happen in 1968. In 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a massive military campaign designed to destroy the foreign invaders. All across the country, key targets were being attacked, and it seemed overnight that the war went from a 6 all the way to an 11. What's so messed up though is even though the VC did not achieve major victories, it was costing a lot of American lives. With the Viet Cong using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the war not only escalated in Vietnam, but had reached neighboring nations like Cambodia. This had an effect on the war back home. The US thought and told people it would be a quick war. They had the advantage. But after the VC flexing their military might, it was clear that more US soldiers would be needed to win the war, which some people were beginning to question in the first place. And as time went on, most people would protest America's involvement. Number 6. Classic humanity. Here I am again talking about YouTube's least favorite S word. I'm here to give you the buzz in history, and that's just how it goes. Probably the worst invention that we've ever come up with since war, but alas, it happened, and it happened in the Ottoman Empire too. It was pretty easy to get rich off the backs of those you whip. What's so messed up is how long it lasted. I'll give you a second to figure out how long. Go ahead. Guess what year it ended in? 1908. Yeah, they kept it going until 1908. While the anti-S-word movement had done their best to remove this heinous activity, it is speculated that it continued up until the 1930s, specifically the trade and sale of women for the deed of deeds. Now you know something's messed up when that outlives your empire. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved shortly after this, during the First World War. Number 5. Data collection. Unlike Facebook and Google and maybe some hackers spying on your data, that's a bad thing. Plague doctors learning about and collecting data was a good thing. Yes, the plague doctors very well could have been coming up with some of the first serious medical documents. At least, well, in a modern sense. What treatments worked? What didn't? Sadly not much. Patients who were healed and cured and others who didn't make it. That list was a lot longer, unfortunately. Despite their unusual treatments, this data collection and trying to zero in on what works and what doesn't was a big part of the job. A job that I know I could never do. Number 4. The rifle or the pen? When the Ottomans had taken Constantinople, it was treated as an absolute win. And for the Ottomans, it kinda was. For every Christian still in the city, not so much. A lot of them were killed, or sold into the situation that Anakin Skywalker left Tatooine for. As their empire grew, they began to take children at a young age. And when I say take, I mean take kids that weren't exactly theirs to take in the first place and convert them to Islam. And give them 2 choices. You're either a politician or you're gonna be a soldier. The politicians surprisingly reached some higher levels of power, but now if this were me, I know I'd end up in the army. I was never too bright. This actually kind of makes sense though. The idea was to create an army of completely loyal soldiers to the Sultan and government bodies that everyone could trust. Cruel, but effective. Number 3. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Another very useful tool in destroying the Vietnamese jungle. Trees are made of wood, and wood burns, so set them ablaze. Except napalm is different. A chemical compound meant to burn at a very hot temperature of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it would burn for a while. This was used in multiple ways, but probably the most effective with airstrikes. While not the first time firebombing had been used, as it was proven effective in the firebombing of Japan during World War II, the Vietnam War saw almost the same amount of ordnance dropped, napalm and others included, as used in all of World War II by America. That is an insane statistic. It had a terrible effect on people as it can burn skin off. The most infamous picture from the Vietnam War had something to do with this. We can't show it to you, but you've probably honestly seen it already. The military would later disband its use, as the ability to control napalm's destructive power is limited. Number 2. Impressive run. Okay, yeah, the Ottomans did some messed up stuff. I called the chief again last night, and he said it wasn't it. But that goes for all civilizations of the past. What's really messed up though is how long the Ottoman Empire lasted. From medieval times to the earliest 20th century, which is pretty close to the modern era. Over 600 years of conquering the Balkans, Middle East, North Africa, and the Caucasus. Like I've said before, you don't get that big and powerful without breaking a few eggs to make your omelets along the way. I am generalizing, but the Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful empires to ever exist, and one of the longest. Encompassing roughly 20 million square kilometers at its peak, had a population of 35 million citizens. Number 1. A man you can trust. Okay, so room full of scantily clad women has to be protected, right? I mean, come on, who's gonna help? You need someone strong, obviously, but you also need somebody you can trust. Someone who will not fall for their devilishly good looks and try to take one of those wives away from your harem. Good thing the Ottomans had eunuchs on speed dial, or rather just had a lot from pillaging other nations and just kind of kept them around. But as silly as it might sound, it does make sense. How could a man be tempted to bed with a woman if he's missing his long John Silver? Right? Number 10. The mask. Probably the most interesting thing about the plague doctors is their mask. Why such a weird shape? I always thought it looked like a crow. Crows and ravens share a lot of iconography with dying and sickness and just bad things in general, which always felt like bad marketing to me. Doctors shouldn't look like that. Anyway, the masks actually did serve a purpose, as they were kinda onto something. The bubonic plague was one of the worst sicknesses the world has ever seen, considering the methods of dealing with such were barbaric compared to today. The masks were designed so nothing could get in, and even had glass eye fixtures like a gas mask. More importantly, at the end of the mask was a beak, or so we'll call it, in a little area where you could put nice smelling herbs and aromas to counteract what was probably the worst smells imaginable. A lot of corpses make for a bad smell. To add insult to injury, the mask may have got its design from satirical theater. Oh, what cruel irony. Number 9. 39.5-foot pole. A compliment to the gothic clothing that they wore, and creepy mask of course, the plague doctors also had a cane. And for once in history it wasn't a beating stick, right? It was a way of poking and prodding patients who were quite ill from a distance. As if your doctors get sick, well then you're in trouble. But the idea here again is to keep your distance from people, as they had figured out that the plague was quite contagious. Did I say the cane was not used to beat people? Yeah, I pulled a sneaky on you. They did. Sometimes they had to use them to ward off crowds of people desperately seeking medical attention. Hordes of people like your least favorite zombie movie. It was a very dangerous job at the time. And as many New Yorkers say, somebody gotta do it. Number 8. The treatments. Surprise, surprise, the treatments for the bubonic plague were not ideal. Well, at least for my tastes. Bloodletting. Someday I'll have to tell you guys the crazy stories that have happened to me and blood. I don't do well with it. I don't know why. You can probably imagine the kind of kid I was. I was a little tank. I used to get cuts, scrapes, bruises all the time. No problem. Blood was the least of my worries and the third most concerning body fluid to find in my clothes. But these days a drop of blood could have me horizontal on the floor. That's why I say no to bloodletting. Based on the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and the balance of such liquids. So releasing some of the blood should balance out the equilibrium, right? Well, that's what they thought. I say no. Leave my blood alone, right? Number 7. The Air Factory. Now this makes sense when you think about it. Ottomans had siblings duking it out in the streets and cradles because of harems. Relax, late night users of the internet, it's a little bit different than what you think that means. Okay, yes, it was a room full of women and ladies of the evening, but these women actually held some political power. An example of this is an extremely influential time for these women that became to be known as the Sultanate of Women. Mothers of sultans often helped choose women for their sons, which I'm sure is the worst blind date ever, and once the women were pregnant, they were no longer permitted to be with the sultan. That child, if born a son, would take a position with his mother in governing a province. There's a lot of rules to this thing, and pretty messed up, but I think if there's something to take away from this, like we should do with all history really, is when you make the succession of your country messy, the politics get messy, and when that happens, you're at the risk of revolution. Number 6. Healers to all. Despite the wealthy doing their best to stay wealthy and not to be poor, avoiding disease in ye olde times was something that they just couldn't dodge. Yes, today the wealthy live better than a lot of people, but the modern average person also lives better than most royalty of the past. Sure, they had access to warm, dry clothes, shelter, better food, hygiene, and a lot of things commoners just didn't. Education for me is the big one there, you gotta learn to read. However, there's still a common denominator, and that's sickness. The plague did not care who or what you are. Still doesn't today. Rich or poor, happy or sad, you can, and if it's the past, most likely will get sick. So the plague doctors had to treat everyone. The statistics of how many people lost their lives to the bubonic plague are staggering. Seriously, look it up, it's a crazy number. Number 5. Civil rights. If you know the 1960s, then you know it was a decade of change. A lot of history to unfold in just 10 years. Again, we could probably do a whole video on that. The Vietnam War is especially important towards the civil rights movement, as black Americans were a big part of the war effort in Vietnam. Black soldiers were nothing new to the American military, but their integration with white soldiers was. Every war previous, soldiers of different skin color were separated into different units. While most soldiers got along, there was still a long way to go, as black soldiers were still often mistreated. It seemed, however, that in a war zone, white Americans and black Americans were fine, but at home had tensions. We could do a whole video on civil rights and segregation, but to sum it up, racial relations made Americans ask questions. And for black Americans, the question is, how is someone expected to fight a war in a foreign country that we really have no business being in, for a country that won't allow a certain group of citizens to even buy a cup of coffee because they're not allowed to enter the building due to the color of their skin? Just doesn't make sense, man. Number 4. Outcasts. Chances are that your family is made up of folks who work in different industries or professions. You probably got an uncle that has something to do with trucks. Maybe your aunts are nurses. Maybe you got some important family members who work in Washington, D.C. or Ottawa. Ooh, fancy. But my point being, even though they all do different things, or maybe even think differently, you can all come together and be a family, especially over a meal. Love a good meal. Plague doctors did not have this and might have been a little lonely, which is sad because they had a really tough job. But basically, because they spent most of the time with infected patients, more than anyone else really, sometimes even they would get sick. This created a sense of mistrust, as sometimes they could be seen as a source of the infection, or the bad air, as it was so commonly called. When employed, they were told not to socialize with commoners. If the last 2 years have taught us anything, it's that I love people and I want to be around them. Come on, hang out, it'd be great. Number 3. Jailhouse King. So eventually people in the Ottoman Empire were not okay with brothers impersonating Abel and Cain. After all, this bloodshed is rather pointless. There's gotta be a better way to choose the next ruler of this empire and still keep everyone alive. How about house arrest? The solution to solve the next heir and to have brothers not be unalive was to keep them in cafes. No, not coffee shops. Lavish prisons for princes, to be exact. Cafe literally translates to cage, and it's where the heirs spent their time locked up, away, safe from harm. Not allowed to leave, but allowed to have female visitation, if you catch my drift. It sounds like a good idea, but locking up somebody for long periods of time, then expecting that person to rule a country that they barely know or seen is kinda messed up. Also, no streaming services and Wi-Fi would make that the worst day ever. I'd give this place 2 stars, man. Number 2. Pray it away. Plague doctors were doing their best with what they had, and in their defense, that wasn't much. But a lot of times back in the day when people thought things went wrong, it was the wrath of God. I mean, what else could it be, right? And for the people at the time, a lot of things went wrong. There's a flood that destroyed your crops. Must be God. Your wife passed away in childbirth. Had to be God. A sickness that's making lots of real estate go up for sale because of the lack of people due to them not breathing anymore. That has to be God. So people needed to do something to please God and make amends. How about whipping yourself for your sin? Yeah, that's right, that's where we're going with this, and they did it. People were whipping themselves to show just how sorry they were. I mean, hey, at least it wasn't like the Aztecs who maybe took it a little too far. Just walking around flogging yourself all day. Just doing one of the, just whipping yourself in the back. Number 1, scapegoats. Sadly, in times of great horror and sadness, you'd think people would come together, work towards a common goal. A disease that threatens the very fabric of human civilization. Well, that has to be the work of God, or maybe it's a certain group or groups of people that the church or government doesn't approve of. Yes, that's right, scapegoats, the blame game. While a scapegoat really can be anything, it sadly oftentimes ends up being a group of people who get targeted, simply because it's easier than dealing with the truth. Not cool, guys, not cool. Number 10. Crying Wolf. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a conflict between Vietnam and US forces in 1964. What's messed up about that is that 2 days later, it happened again. Actually, it didn't. Big prank. The second incident was fabricated by the US just to justify ramping up their presence in Vietnam. Sadly, it worked, as the next 8 years in Vietnam would end up being a total snipe storm for the US, as they would encounter problems abroad and at home. Thank goodness this is the only time the American government would ever lie about anything ever again, right? This was officially declassified decades later. Number 9. Agent Orange. The world agreed not to use chemical warfare after the First World War, as it was extremely cruel and lethal. So, you might be surprised that America used chemical weapons during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange, brought to you by the Dow Chemical Company, was a herbicide and defoliant dropped and sprayed from air vehicles to cut down the thick jungle brush. Viet Cong soldiers were excellent at living off the land and concealing themselves in the jungle. Bad guy hides in jungle, you remove the jungle. Makes sense. The chemical was extremely effective, but what's so messed up was the negative health side effects. Soldiers that were exposed to the chemical developed cancers years after the war. But what's even more crazy is how it affected the Vietnamese people. It created children with really bad health defects, and to this day there are many people who live with ill side effects of Agent Orange. That's just not right, man. That's wrong. That is so wrong, dude. Number 8. French Indochina. The US was not the first superpower trying to tame Vietnam. Vietnam used to be called French Indochina, and it used to be a colony of France. And when they no longer wanted to be a part of that, France came down to give them a piece of their minds. But you can probably guess how that went, considering the US was there 20 years later trying to do the same thing. While France was trying to keep a colony and the US was trying to stop communism from spreading to other countries, Vietnam was trying to fight for its independence, which is ironic for America because that's how they became a country. And yes, I know that the communist movement in Vietnam wasn't great by any standards, but the regime America was trying to put in place was no better. As much as France would have liked to keep Vietnam, times were changing, and there was no victory in sight, with or without American support. Number 7. The Treatments Part 2. Well, as if having a man in a very scary mask with a large stick who strongly smells of mint draining you of your precious life juice wasn't the worst part of your day, then perhaps the other offerings he had up his sleeve will ruin your day. Some patients were instructed to pull Bear Grylls and drink the forbidden lemonade. That's pee in case you were wondering. Bumps and boils would be poked and prodded at. Sometimes toads were rubbed all over you. Okay. Lancing the bubbles that formed on the skin, because that's what happens with the plague, inducing vomiting and diarrhea, and of course the ye olde tried and true treatment of mercury, because yes, consuming a liquid metal has to cure me of this awfulness, right? I'm sure it won't make me feel worse because it's poison or anything. Number 6. A terrible loss of life. The Vietnam War is one of the most important events in US history, and honestly world history too. It was a very hot war during the Cold War, which we could do a whole video on that itself. A time of superpowers ready to annihilate one another at the push of a red button. Thousands of young men volunteered or were drafted to fight in a war that would humble the very powerful country. 58,141 Americans would lose their lives in order to contain communism. Of that 61%, they were under the age of 21. That is an insane, I can't even believe that. The Vietnamese lost over 300,000 people in the conflict. The war is remembered for being a tragic loss of life, and the domino theory that communism would spread throughout the world if containment was not initiated didn't happen, as most countries today just aren't communist. Number 5. Semper Fi. Okay, you've traveled back in time, you said to yourself, hey, I played tons of video games. I love ancient civilizations. I too wish to be a part of a massing army where we will vanquish our foes and gallantly fought battles. Once we reign victorious, we shall celebrate with a feast of grandeur and wine to soak our troubled souls. I am so pleased with the display of the enemy's blood that I am not even going to bathe for a week. Au contraire, my chivalry late night gamers. The Ottomans were quite the opposite. The Janissaries were an elite force, but the officers in the military had very strict rules. When setting up camps, there was to be no consumption of alcohol. A strict rationing and sanitation was to be very important. You'd think how tough being in an army like that would be, how far a little rest and relaxation will go. Come on, lighten up, guys. Number 4. Mattel 16. The 1960s saw a lot of technological development. The extensive use of the helicopter comes to mind. During the early years of the Vietnam War, Americans were issued a brand new rifle. The M16 was a brand new design that flopped as hard as it could, as it tended not to work, which, if you're in a war, is kind of not what you want to happen. Your stuff's kind of gotta work. A rumor had spread around that the firearm never needed to be cleaned, which in a jungle setting with mud and rain just doesn't make any sense. This, with already existing flaws, made it jam and was rendered useless by soldiers. Nicknamed the Mattel 16 after the toy company, some soldiers were forced to use enemy weapons, which sadly in some cases may have led to fatal incidents of friendly fire. Number 3. Autopsies. Yes, the doctors of the Black Plague also had some autopsies to perform, which honestly, straight up, I can't imagine was a good idea. I mean, the whole no hand washing thing and like the piles of bodies everywhere, it just couldn't have been good for everyone's health. So why bother opening any of them up? Just leave them be. Get a fire going maybe, you can deal with it that way, you know what I'm saying? All I'm saying is it ain't no secret why these folks with all the smelly pustules were dropping off. However, in addition to the data collection, this was important as it gave literally almost a limitless supply of practice, experience, to see what makes us tick. Was it a boom in modern medicine? No, not really. But like a lot of medicine and science we understand today, we had to break a few eggs to get our omelet, or in this case, carve out a few chest cavities. Man, the convoy of carriages needed to carry out those bodies must have been crazy. No thanks. Number 2. GI Kebab. While the Viet Cong may not have won many battles against the US, they were still formidable fighters. They had the lay of the land and laid traps everywhere. From 1965 to 1970, 11% of American casualties were related to Viet Cong placed traps. What's so messed up in that is that in a modern war with modern technology, a lot of the traps the Viet Cong were using were something out of the Stone Age. but still deadly. Improvised explosives, swinging spiked balls, tripwires, single shot cartridges, and snake pits right out of Indiana Jones. I can't even believe that's real. But the most effective were punji pits, or punji sticks. A large hole is dug and bamboo spikes are placed at the bottom. Then, out of pure evil, urine or human excrement is put on the spikes. A thin layer of leaves or cover is placed on the trap, so when someone comes along they would fall in a pit of spikes that if that didn't kill them, an infection from the waste would, or make recovery very, very miserable. That is cruel, man. That ain't right, man. That ain't right, Chief. Number 1. Apocalypse Now. Tiger Force was a long-range reconnaissance unit that later became known for its acts of war crimes. Not sure if there could be war crimes when everyone's doing naughty things, but okay. To quote Martin Sheen in Apocalypse Now, charging someone with murder around here is like handing out speeding tickets at the Indy 500. And like a scene right out of that movie, the members of Tiger Force had a tradition to make necklaces out of ears. I'm going to say that again. They made necklaces out of ears. There are a number of things Tiger Force committed that are honestly just not safe for life. But that's war at the end of the day. War is hell.